Welcome to F4 Talks. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is a very eminent guest today, a gentleman called Shadi Hamid. Shadi is in Brookings. He's a great scholar. He's also a fantastic human being. It's been an honor and a pleasure and a privilege getting to know him over the years. And Shadi is a prolific author. He's also a very thoughtful and insightful author. I always learn a lot when I read him, and I hope you do too. Shadi has written a lot, many books, and his latest book is The Problem of Democracy. And those of you who have registered for this talk know that he talks about various conundrums democracy throws up. What happens when democracy produces, quote unquote, bad outcomes? What happens when, say, Islamist parties win through elections, free and fair elections? And of course, this is not a problem confined to the Middle East, as we know that democracy has thrown what some would call suboptimal outcomes all the way from Hungary to Great Britain, not so great anymore, and indeed the US. Without further ado, let's go cracking in. Shadi, welcome, and thank you for being here. And we'll throw you a very easy question. What is the problem of democracy?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Atul, for having me and the kind introduction. Pleasure to be with you. So the problem of democracy is both simple and complicated. It's simple because it can be described, in a somewhat straightforward fashion. And you alluded to this, that we like democracy in theory, or at least most of us do, but increasingly we find that we're uncomfortable with democracy's outcomes. And this isn't necessarily a new problem, but it's a problem that's being felt more intensely in the West in particular, because there was a time when Americans and Western Europeans felt largely insulated from this democratic dilemma. So when we thought about democratic dilemmas, we tended to think about the Middle East. And as you mentioned, in free and fair elections, when Islamist parties would do very well or even win outright. And that's a bit of a long story in the region. Some viewers might be aware of 1991 in Algeria, where an Islamist party was on the verge of a big victory, and then the secular military intervened and canceled the elections, triggering a civil war that continued for the rest of a decade. Also,
I remember that very, very well. I'm old enough, as you can see.
Yeah. I was a bit probably younger, but it certainly is an incident that it's a flashpoint that scholars of the Middle East often go back to, because what we saw in Algeria has repeated in obviously different ways and to different extents, but that dilemma that was exposed in 1991 is still with us, especially when it comes to American administrations that say they want to see more democracy in the Middle East, but then they can't follow through. Why? Because we still can't get past this issue that the parties that win, it's not just that they're Islamists. It's not just a question of Islam's role in public life, but also the fact that Islamist parties tend to be critical of American foreign policy and specifically anti-Israel. And if preserving Israel's security is a top priority, then you have to sort of think to yourself, well, I like democracy on one hand. On the other hand, I care about Israel's security. And this is something that certainly affected the George W. Bush administration. 2006, Hamas won the January elections that year. And then George W. Bush was put in this quandary, and one that wasn't really resolved. So, and maybe just the other thing I'll say to bring it back to the Western context that some of you, for those of you who are, living in the West, that in some ways the Middle East was ahead of its time. Like during the Arab Spring, I remember thinking that the Middle East was somewhat unique because the things that people were debating were foundational questions. They weren't about policy, like universal health care, marginal tax rates, deficit spending. No one was talking about that. What they were talking about was the role of Islam in public life, the relationship between Islamic law and the state, what it means to be an Egyptian, what it means to be a nation. These are the so-called who we are questions. In America, we had been used to having conversations that were more tangible. They weren't about existential questions. And some of you might recall the good old days that were quaint and innocent with Barack Obama, but there was a multi-day controversy around the fact that he wore a tan suit at a press conference. And that was an outrage. Oh my God, how does he have the audacity, fashion-wise, to wear a tan suit? People were bored, apparently. But now in America, we've sort of caught up with history, or history is caught up with us. And this goes for many Western European democracies as well, most recently in Italy and Sweden, where far-right parties did very well. So we are dealing with those existential questions. So now the Middle East doesn't seem as foreign. Now I think Americans can maybe better relate to the dilemmas of the Arab Spring, and it's come home. And the very obvious example here is when Donald Trump won in 2016, but also, hopefully it won't happen, but, anything is possible. If Donald Trump or someone like him wins in 2024, many Americans will ask themselves this question, which is democracy good if it doesn't produce good outcomes? Do we believe in democracy because of its outcomes or in spite of its outcomes?
Of course, you're raising a very problematic philosophical question. What is good? And that you're getting into very shifty territory. But the problem of democracy isn't new. After all, the Athenian democracy collapsed. The glorious Periclean age came to an end. Demagogues took over, so much so that someone like Plato was disillusioned with politics, and ipso facto, he imagined the Republic, which was basically a form of proto-communist state. Now, you talked about the US interfering in elections. The US interfered in elections in Latin America for decades during the Cold War. And today you have a pink tide and left-leaning leaders have been elected all across Latin America. This wouldn't have been possible at the height of the Cold War, because this wouldn't have suited US interests. Right now, there is no countervailing Soviet Union for these countries or these parties to ally with. So there's always, when it comes to, there are two things. One, internal within a democracy, meaning you may have disintegration into interest groups, and you may have identity politics, and you may have short-termism. Those are the risks that democracy has. And then a superpower that espouses to uphold democracy has to make the hard choice between upholding principle and interests. After all, despite Adnan Khashoggi getting chopped up in Turkey, Joe Biden still turned up for a fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman.
Yes. Yeah, so there's a lot of good points there, and I can just kind of riff off of them. I think so this is an ancient debate. And I think that especially Americans have this notion of democracy, and they don't know a lot about the historical context. Try doing a survey with even friends of yours in America. Why do you think democracy is good? And I think you'll actually see many of them struggle, because we assume that democracy is good, that we haven't put in the effort to offer up rationales. Why do we think it's good? Let's go back to first principles and really dig deeper. That becomes challenging. There's also a tendency to use the word democracy as shorthand for liberal democracy. But one thing I discuss in my book and in a lot of my writing is that there is overlap, obviously, between small d democracy and small l liberalism, but they are not coterminous. And sometimes they are in tension with each other. So when we talk about democracy, We're talking about alternation of power through regular elections, popular sovereignty, responsiveness to the electorate, where with liberalism, we're talking about individual autonomy, personal freedom, the primacy of the individual over the collective, the primacy of reason over revelation, moving towards gender equality, minority rights, so on and so forth. So more or less what we associate with the US Bill of Rights or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But you can imagine any number of scenarios where those won't go together. And that was something that has always been implicit in the democratic idea from the times of Athens and so forth in the pre-modern period, going through to the founders. I mean, if you see what Madison and John Adams had to say about democracy, they had serious concerns about the risk of demagoguery and what happens when you have factionalization. Can democracy survive? And just, I always like to mention at least one quote from the founders. So, because some of this stuff is intense. So Madison, I mean, the father of the Constitution, in the Federalist Papers says, quote unquote, democracies are as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. That's some strong imagery right there. So I think that's just worth keeping in mind, that there is a broader history here. On Latin America, it's a really good point, because we saw some of this in Latin America for much of the Cold War, that we wanted to prop up right-wing dictators who were our partners in the anti-communist struggle, and we overthrew democratically elected governments, many times. And obviously 73 in Chile with Allende is the prototypical example. And it took a long time for Chile to recover from that. And the hope was that with the decline of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the US would no longer have an excuse to not support democracy, because you could always sort of put Latin America and other situations that are part of the struggle against the Soviet Union, put an asterisk next to them and say, look, the US had difficulty supporting democracy because there was this ultimate geopolitical struggle, and that distorted our foreign policy, and understandably so. And then in the 1980s and 1990s, we see the US correcting for those errors and starting to support democratic transitions in Latin America, in East Asia, Brazil, Argentina, Guatemala, Uruguay, South Korea, Philippines, and so on. And the question is, why didn't that happen in the Middle East? Why was the Middle East the exception in this post-Cold War period when there was a lot of triumphalism around democracy?
After all, Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History.
Yeah, but there wasn't an end of history in the Middle East. The Middle East
history has never ended, even here. This country had its own civil war in 1861. I mean, it's frightening when Americans say it's history and they mean it's meaningless. And in the rest of the world, it's history means it's sacred. So, the beginnings of the cultural divides.
Yeah. It is worth noting that Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay recently in the Atlantic that has the title of "It's Still the End of History" or something to that effect. And it's an intriguing thing to consider. And it, has history ended? What does it mean for history to return anyway? But last thing I'll just say on the last point you made, Atul, about principles versus interest. Obviously, I'm a big democracy promotion supporter. I think the US should do a much better job of living up to its rhetoric. Now, the question is, does that come into conflict with certain US national security interests? This is another long-standing dilemma and always a debate that we have in foreign policy circles here in Washington, D.C. And I try to be very straight up in the book and say there will be short-term costs. If we embrace a full-throated democracy promotion policy in the Middle East, it's not going to be some panacea. It's not going to work out perfectly. there will be outcomes that we find troubling. It will require us to adapt and adjust. And there could be retaliation from authoritarian regimes who say, oh, if the US is going to put pressure on us, let's see how they like it if we do X, Y, and Z.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't want to pretend that those costs aren't there, because that's not realistic. We have to be aware of the situation. So my argument is explicitly that we should be willing to absorb short-term costs in the interest of long-term objectives. Now, it's not easy to do this, because often politicians are thinking in terms of electoral cycles.
You have elections every 2 years in the US.
Yeah, right. For the House and for Congress. But in the presidency, there's still, there is a short-term aspect to it, and this is also always something that presidents feel a lot of pressure to, keep domestic sentiment in mind and to prioritize short-term wins. But I think that model of stability first, stability at any cost, has proven a failure time and time again. I don't think that you can look at the last 5-6 decades of US policy in the Middle East and say this has worked out wonderfully. No one thinks of the Middle East as a font of stability, peace, and prosperity. So clearly our dedication to supporting autocratic regimes has not actually brought forward great results. And the Arab Spring itself was a reminder that authoritarian regimes seem stable only until they're not. And when they're not, it's too late. And I worry that we're preparing ourselves to fall into the same trap. I don't think there will be another Arab Spring anytime soon. But if we're thinking 10 or 15 years from now, if there are democratic openings in some of these countries, are we going to have the same debates all over again and get tripped up by the same dilemmas, these democratic dilemmas? And I'm concerned that our eye is off the ball, and Americans aren't paying as much attention to the Middle East. But you know what they say, something like, well, first of all, what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. That if bad things happen in these countries, we can't pretend that we in the West are going to be insulated from that. And again, we saw that during the Arab Spring, the ripple effects, including from the refugee crisis in Syria and so forth. So these things are worth keeping in mind. Life and politics are about trade-offs. And the question is, do we want to prioritize long-term over the short-term, or are we willing to just continue with this ad hoc approach of deferring to autocratic regimes? And then at some point, they destabilize. And I would argue there's a bigger argument here that authoritarian regimes are inherently unstable because they are, in some fundamental sense, not aligned with human nature. And we're seeing now in China a place where everyone, people are happy with the CCP and that sort of thing. But there comes a point where people start to say, why can't we have a say in our own affairs, especially if authoritarian regimes aren't delivering on their economic promises? And authoritarian regimes don't always deliver on their economic promises. Then the authoritarian bargain doesn't seem like such a bargain.
All right. So let's take a case study. Saudi Arabia, long-standing American ally. Not exactly the greatest advertisement for democracy and human rights, has now jumped into bed with Russia. OPEC Plus has clearly slighted Joe Biden and the Americans and said, hang on a minute, forget about increasing oil production. We are going to cut oil production. But it's all good at the moment because they're getting more dollars, and so the Russians, everything is fine. What does the US do now? Will it find democracy promotion is in its interests? Or will they be terrified of the prospects of the likes of Osama bin Laden getting elected?
Yeah. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a great case to focus on because it captures a lot of these tensions in a pretty profound way. The irony of this Saudi case is that the US has tried quite hard to be nice to MBS. I mean, Biden basically prostrated himself before MBS over the summer. And there has been this effort to repair relations with the thinking that if we do that, we'll get something in return. After all, if we have these authoritarian allies, then the whole point is that we get something out of them, tangible things. But I think Saudi Arabia shows the fundamental weakness of this approach. Even so the authoritarian allies that we've given tens of billions of dollars of advanced weaponry to, we provide Saudi Arabia its security umbrella. Despite
and turn a blind eye over Yemen.
Yeah, exactly. Despite all of that, this is how the Saudi leadership repaid President Biden. And it's really shocking when you think about it. So if you're gonna stick with authoritarian allies, you better be sure they're gonna actually stay on side when there's a geopolitical struggle with Russia. But even there, as you're saying, there has been this movement towards Russia, which in some ways should be interpreted as MBS pretty much giving the middle finger to the US. He's testing us. He's saying, I can get away with this. And the unfortunate truth of it is that he probably can, but it's up to American policymakers to change that kind of calculation. That has been historically what Saudi leaders assume, that they can get away quite literally with murder, because the US will always back down in a staring contest. Even if we start putting pressure on the Saudis, they can just hold strong and bluff about moving towards China and Russia for their military provisions. It's worth noting that because of the interoperability of weapon systems, Saudi Arabia cannot replace US military support with Russian or Chinese military support. It would be extremely difficult to do and take a very long time to make such a fundamental shift in how their entire military is structured and oriented. So I've been an advocate of playing hardball with our allies, in our authoritarian allies. And if we wanted to, we could ground the Saudi military in the matter of weeks. So if we suspended spare parts and maintenance, the Saudis wouldn't be able to run their jets and their tanks. And we've never been willing to use that leverage, this kind of maximal leverage, but we have it. And leverage, when unused, atrophies, because then the other country just they don't believe that you're ever going to do anything. So you can use the rhetoric, but we've heard this rhetoric before. So at some point you have to show that the threat is credible, and then play that out.
To give them an offer they can't refuse.
Right, exactly. That's another way of putting it.
Send in Luca Brasi.
Sorry?
Send in Luca Brasi and get him to hold a gun to their head.
Yeah, right. So that is. Yeah, so in practice, that's a sort of thing that we can do, and it applies to other allies that are just very, the Egyptian military. There's a similar story there, and I think the bigger context here is to not forget that Saudi Arabia needs the U.S. more than the U.S. needs Saudi Arabia. And I think sometimes as Americans, we almost get it in reverse. We act like the opposite is true. And then you sort of ask yourself, wait, we're the superpower here. And I've said elsewhere that if an alien came down and didn't have any prior context and saw Biden's meeting with MBS over the summer, that alien would have been right to assume that Saudi Arabia was the superpower and we were a third world backwater that just had a lot of oil and not much else. Because why else would Biden be treating MBS this way? So we have to completely reorient our understanding of these bilateral relationships.
But hang on a moment, you're capturing something which is both a strength and a weakness of democracy. Biden faced an election. Biden wanted oil prices to go down before that election. He wanted to get a handle on inflation. Ipso facto, whilst he was representing the US, he was also in a weaker position because the voters blame inflation on the president. So ironically, democracy can sometimes lead to appeasement. We saw that in the 1930s with Neville Chamberlain.
Yeah, it's a good point. It is worth noting, though, that even if the Saudis had been a little bit more helpful on oil, various analysts who kind of crunched the numbers came back and said, well, it would have some effect on oil prices in the US, but not significant enough to really have an effect on ordinary American consumers in any kind of meaningful or noticeable way. There was always a question of whether the premise would hold that this would actually make a difference and help Biden and the Democrats in the midterms. But
politicians don't think like analysts.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, the deference to the Saudis didn't even get, like, so even if we take your point, Atul, there's still the issue that this kind of approach that Biden took didn't get him what he wanted anyway. It got him the opposite, which tells us something about the reliability of these fair weather friends. Yeah. They are they're reckless, and they act like rogue actors even when we want them to do something completely different.
So let me ask you, let's say you get democracy in Saudi Arabia and Osama bin Laden gets elected, then what do you do?
Well, first of all, when I talk about putting pressure on the Saudi regime, I'm not saying that we should pressure them to become a democracy overnight. That's not realistic. I still, try to the extent possible to live in the real world. And Saudi Arabia doesn't even have a parliament. It might be different if we're talking about countries that already have a limited electoral competition, that already have political parties, that have some degree of free expression, like Morocco and Jordan. Saudi Arabia is starting basically from scratch. So what I would ask from the Saudis would actually be more modest. It's not become a democracy. It's become less repressive than you currently are. Open up space gradually, move in the right direction. That's the least we can ask for. And obviously there's different metrics that we can look at in that regard. And that would be something we'd have to think about very carefully. How would we want to measure progress over a certain period of time? But the metrics wouldn't be holding an election in a year. Saudi Arabia has to do a lot to get to a point where they can hold meaningful elections. Now, when they do hold meaningful elections, let's say 10 or 15 years from now, hypothetically, there's always this fear that radicals will come to power. I would maybe question that, because Saudi Arabia has a new generation that actually does seem to want more social and cultural freedom. One thing that younger Saudis do like about MBS is that he's lessened the grip of the religious police. So, it's not clear to me that radicals would necessarily be the victors. But even if they were, or maybe if they would get some share of the vote, needless to say that if you want to participate even in a minimalistic democracy, you generally shouldn't have an armed wing. So Osama bin Laden in this analogy would need to commit to the democratic process and say, okay, I'm disbanding my militia, or Al Qaeda is, not going to operate, or, whatever it might be. So there are certain things that you would need from militant or radical groups. But if we're talking more broadly about Islamist parties should have the right to participate and the right to win, even if they're not liberal. All I really ask for is a commitment to procedural democracy. And to me, that's an easier ask, because democracy as a mechanism doesn't have inherent ideological value. You can be a socialist and support democracy, or an Islamist, or a liberal. Democracy doesn't predetermine the ideological outcomes, right? So that to me is easier than saying to Islamists that if you want to participate, you guys have to become liberals. And that's oftentimes the implication of what outsiders tell them, that, Islamists they have to commit to all these liberal values before we feel comfortable with them. But that's a big ask. How do you ask non-liberals to become liberals? Or Islamists by definition are not liberals, because if they were liberals, they wouldn't be Islamists. So there's also this sense that for democracy to be representative, it has to reflect different ideological currents in society. In religiously conservative societies, one of those currents is the Islamist current.
So, taking you up on that, let's examine two places you know very well, and you mentioned one of them, Palestine, where Hamas indubitably wins elections. It also provides services that Fatah doesn't quite manage. Fatah is too discredited because of its long history of corruption, nepotism, and frankly, collaboration with the Israelis as the Palestinians perceive it. So you are in this curious situation that, yes, you want democracy, but then Hamas is likely to win. And in Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood did win, and there was a short-lived stint of their government in power. So what do you do with situations like that? And by the way, of course, as an aside, I heard Bibi Netanyahu on Jordan Peterson waxing lyrical about such things. So you have some stiff competition for eyeballs.
Wow, Bibi was on Jordan Peterson's podcast. Wow,
Yes,
I did not see that coming.
I heard him on YouTube yesterday, just for kicks.
Wow, I'll have to check that out. So yeah, these are good test cases. You know, in the example of Egypt, we can actually look at what the Muslim Brotherhood did in government. Mohammed Morsi was president for about a year before the military coup in July 2013. And we can ask ourselves, I mean, was it the end of the world from an American standpoint? Was it uncomfortable? Were there points of tension? Yes. But it's unclear to me whether the current situation, which is a brutal dictatorship, like why we would have ever thought that the alternative would have been preferable. Or perhaps we thought somehow that the military stepping in against the Muslim Brotherhood would restore democracy. That was the famous quote from Secretary of State John Kerry a month after the coup in August 2013. He said that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is restoring democracy. So there's also this illusion that you can start over. If things aren't going well, you can do a reset.
By the way, this is under the Obama administration.
Yes.
This is not
very
under
clear
George
about
W.
it.
Bush or Donald Trump, just to clarify.
Yeah. And one of the things I try to do in my book is reconstruct the months leading up to the coup in Egypt. And I come to the conclusion, and I also did a lot of interviews with senior Obama officials who were in the room with Obama at key moments and who were thinking about what to do about the Muslim Brotherhood. And my conclusion is that we gave the U.S. gave Sisi what amounted to a green light. It wasn't it wasn't like, go do this coup. But if we look at what Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said at key moments in the lead up, it was very deferential to Sisi. And one of the quotes is to the effect, he said to Sisi, "You do what you need to do to protect your country." And this was previously reported by the New York Times as David Kirkpatrick in his book, Into the Hands of the Soldiers. I did additional interviews, and there's some, additional very interesting quotes that I think offer some more revelations about to what extent this pro-autocracy sentiment was in the government. And one thing I did was interview several people who were on the calls between Hagel and Sisi in the lead up to the coup. And Hagel was a big part of the problem here. And also John Kerry was someone who was sympathetic to Sisi and really had gotten sick of Morsi. He was just throwing up his hands for a number of different reasons that I discussed. But this is all to say that it's not just a question of Obama himself. Obama was also kind of ambivalent at key moments, but there also wasn't clear direction from the White House. There was a delegation to Chuck Hagel and to the State Department under John Kerry, and they weren't always acting on the same page. And that's why Sisi knew that he could play on those divisions. So the basic idea here is that this has been a problem both under Democrats and Republicans. And the case of Hamas is legendary. And Condoleezza Rice talks about this in her memoirs, that when she heard the news that Hamas won, it was about 5 a.m. and she was jogging on her treadmill. And she talks about how this was just such a panic-inducing thing, and she almost fell off her treadmill. That people didn't see this coming. The Bush administration didn't see this coming. Why? Because they had this assumption that good things go together, that if democracy is good, other good things will result. So the assumption here is that Palestinians
The
have
operative
given the
question is what is good for the people of
yeah
Palestine? Perhaps Hamas is good. For the
yeah
people of Israel,
and
Bibi is good. For the people of India, the Bharatiya Janata Party is good. The US didn't
yeah
see the BJP victory either in 2014.
exactly. We as like rational secular liberals, we think that we know what is a good outcome for other societies that we're not familiar with, and then we find out that the people in these countries have a different opinion about their own interest. So there's also got to be a little bit of intellectual humility about what we can assume about other contexts. For a number of reasons, enough Palestinians thought to themselves that Hamas was the better option. We can disagree with their rationale. We can say that they made a mistake, but then there's something kind of patronizing and presumptuous to say that we know what the interests of the Palestinian people are more than Palestinians themselves. Like, you don't want to put yourself in that kind of presumptive position. So I think that, and if you look at George W. Bush and how he used to talk about democracy during the so-called freedom agenda, there was always this sense that democracy would lead to moderation, that democracy would produce pro-American outcomes, rational and reasonable outcomes. This was really at the heart of some of the arguments around Iraq, that once you give Iraqis the vote, once you kind of unleash their natural inclinations towards the good, they're going to make good decisions, and then Iraq will it'll right itself and things will go in a positive direction. But obviously that's not the way that it worked out. Bush was also a proponent of the pothole theory of democracy. He has this famous quote in a press conference where someone asked him, with the upcoming Lebanese elections, I think the ones that were going to happen in 2005, the reporter says, well, what about Hezbollah? A Shia Islamist party that had a military wing and still does. And he basically said that, I wish I had the exact quote, but it's something along the lines of, I believe that if the Lebanese people are given a chance, they will vote for people who will fill their potholes. That is going to be their priority because that's going to be practical, and that's the pothole theory of democracy. But Bush was
here's the challenge. Yeah. Challenge with that theory is that it is Hamas who fills the potholes, and the corrupt elite steal the money and put it in Paris, or perhaps in Georgetown, where you have the Rafiq Hariri school. So the Lebanese secular elites have completely discredited themselves because they've been stealing too much money, taking it out of the country, and been unable to even collect rubbish. It is Hamas who manages to deliver public services, whether it is potholes or hospitals.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So you add another complication, that it's not that there is an inherent tension between being a militant group and filling the potholes. Sometimes, as you say, it is the militant groups that are better at filling the potholes. So that, okay, here's the exact quote, just to give you guys a little a reminder of how Bush used to talk about some of these issues in this kind of endearingly naive way. So yes, this was in 2005, and this is what Bush said to the question of Hezbollah doing well. He said this, quote unquote, "I like the idea of people running for office. There's a positive effect. Maybe some will run for office and say, vote for me. I look forward to blowing up America. But I don't think so. I think people who generally run for office say, vote for me. I'm looking forward to fixing your potholes." So it really captures this in a quite explicit way. He's saying that on one hand, you vote for people who blow things up. On the other hand, you vote for people who fix your potholes, and naturally people will choose the latter. So I think that when we look at some of the deeper normative and philosophical aspects of a democratic idea, we have to disentangle democracy from a progressive vision of history, that this idea that there is an arc of history and that everyone's going to follow a certain teleological direction, which is they adopt democracy, then they become more quote unquote reasonable, rational, liberal, secular, so on and so forth. And I think that, as I've said before, it's not just a Middle East issue, but this idea is being challenged throughout the world, including in our most advanced democracies, including right here in America.
You've touched upon something fascinating, which is that the US remains universalist, and the US believes that its model of democracy will hold everywhere. And when ideology, or shall we say, naive, idealistic, if we want to be charitable, vision hits reality, we know what happens. Now, Iraq, you mentioned Iraq. Iraq is on the verge of civil war. Its democracy is completely dysfunctional. Iran has run riot in Iraq. What do you have to say about Iraq as an exemplar of Bushian democracy, or for the future of democracy in the region?
Yeah. So as outspoken a supporter of democracy promotion as I am, I make a clear distinction between supporting democracy through incentives and punitive actions, as I mentioned before, vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. These are non-military means where no one's talking about doing another Iraq or invading Saudi Arabia and occupying part of Saudi territory and that sort of thing. So when people lump together these different ideas and say, well, we tried democracy promotion with the Bush administration, look what happened with Iraq, they're conflating two different things. Because the Iraq War was not fundamentally, at least certainly not initially, about promoting democracy in Iraq. It was about weapons of mass destruction. The democracy rationale increased in importance once it was realized that there weren't these WMDs. So it's just worth remembering also some of the history and the official justifications for the war. And I actually got my start in a post 9/11 context in the anti-war movement at Georgetown University when I was an undergrad. That was one of my formative moments, is opposing this war and doing sit-ins, die-ins, and tent-ins, some of which I helped organize on campus. It was stupid. It was a stupid war. But if I kind of fast forward, I can also say, I think it's possible to hold two ideas simultaneously that might otherwise seem to be in tension. Do I think Iraq is better off today without Saddam than with Saddam? Yes, I can also say that. That doesn't justify the war. It doesn't mean the ends justify the means. I wish it had never happened at all, but we are where we are now. And I think at least Iraqis today have a better future relative to what they would have had under Saddam. At least now there is agency. They can choose different political parties. There has been alternation of power. There is some degree of freedom of expression. There is real political competition. So,
Shadi, Saddam would have probably died by now. He wouldn't.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Forever. So this idea that they're better off now, they probably would have been better off, but are they better off than they would have been without the intervention? And can Iraq itself exist? Can it hold? To quote William Butler Yeats, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And that applies to Iraq today. You're a Middle East scholar, you know exactly the situation right now on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a very good point about the challenge of doing counterfactual analysis. I mean, usually when people are introducing counterfactuals, they'll give a very rosy version of the counterfactual and they'll say, oh, if Saddam was still in power, we wouldn't have X, Y, Z, no civil conflict, civil war.
No, he would have been gassing the Marsh Arabs. He would have been killing the Kurds.
Yeah.
He was a horrifically brutal dictator.
Yeah, and there could have been an uprising.
Initially supported by the US against Iran.
Yes, that is worth pointing out. Another example of this sort of thing. Same thing with Libya. We say, oh, only, it probably would have been better off if Gaddafi had stayed in power. How do we know that? Because Libya could have been more like Syria under Assad when Assad stayed. That was the worst case scenario. As bad as Libya has been and was post Arab Spring, it didn't reach the levels of civil civil war and violence that we saw in Syria. But Syria is an example where the dictator stayed in power, and Libya is an example where the dictator was ousted by an international coalition. So there are all these
I
different
think there are further elements to it. Syria is closer to Iran. Syria has the big port in the Mediterranean where the Russians are there. So Syria is a slightly different kettle of fish. But the point stands that as horrific as the situation in Libya may be, and the civil war still continues, Gaddafi might have been worse. That point is taken. But the question is about democracy. To bring it back, do you think democracy in Iraq can succeed? Or do you think it'll disintegrate into civil war? Do you think Iraq as a country can survive? Or do you think it's inevitable it'll break apart?
Well, it has survived. I mean, there have been obviously periods of civil war, including, during the period where ISIS was able to capture significant parts of Iraqi territory. So this is not to say that Iraq is a model of anything in particular, but I don't think we can say Iraq has not returned to the old authoritarian ways. There still is a parliamentary system, whatever its faults. That, to me, that tells us that it's a little bit more complicated than saying Iraq failed. What does it mean to say Iraq failed? There isn't a full-blown civil war now. And there has been more stabilization after the very difficult mid-decade in the 2010s. That was obviously a dark period for Iraq, but ultimately ISIS was pushed out and the government was able to recapture the territory. Let's just remember that democracy is messy and chaotic. That's not a justification. That's not a way of saying after the fact, well, it's good that we went into Iraq. And, when Rumsfeld said, he had that famous quote, I can't remember. It's something like, shit happens in a democracy. No, that's not a way. You don't use that to justify the total collapse of order in a self-serving way. But can we say that historically many democracies do experience civil war? We can say that because we've seen it in a number of our own countries. So this idea that Iraq from 2003 and now it is 2022, we're talking about 19 years. Is it really fair to render a definitive verdict and say Iraq failed after only 19 years of this ongoing democratic experience? I just don't think that's a fair metric. And I think we as Western observers, as fair observers, if you will, I think that we've become very impatient. We just assume that democracy will work itself out very quickly, and we forget that it is a very challenging process.
So I'll take your argument there as a fair observer. Let me ask you a simpler question. Do you think democracy is possible within the borders of Sykes, defined by Sykes-Picot, within the Sykes-Picot construct? Because you know and I know that a lot of these lines are extraordinarily arbitrary. And you do not have the evolution of these countries as you had the evolution of England or France. These are nation states that evolved, obviously, after a long period of war, bloodshed. France is on its fifth republic, as Peter Isaacson has just pointed out to us. It has been bloody. It has had the reign of terror. It has had its Napoleonic era and Charles de Gaulle era and whatnot, and Louis Napoleon era. So they've not been a continuous democracy. So that is all true, but the borders of France, the borders of UK, the borders of Germany, and a lot of European states are, shall we say, a little less incongruous than those in the Middle East. And given the ethnic rivalries, given the religious schisms, is it not time, in the words of a former general who headed Sandhurst, is it not time for the borders of the Middle East to be redrawn a century hence?
Well, I guess that raises the question, who would redraw them? So that's ultimately still a question of who decides, and
Mhm.
how do we, I mean, how do we judge what a fair border outcome would actually look like? I think the fact of the
Let me
matter,
give you a practical example. Let's say if the Kurds in Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, if they wanted a state, and if they democratically voted for one, uh, would that be all right? Would America allow it? Turkey's a NATO ally. Iraq
it
is.
might be, yeah, it might be all right from a normative standpoint.
Yeah.
Would it be all right in terms of conflict on the ground? Probably not, because it would, or it would arouse an outbreak of pretty intense violence. Because as you said, we have two other allies, the Turks and the Iraqis, who are not going to look kindly upon that. So this is also fits into the good things don't go together idea.
Exactly.
Is that if you have a good thing for the Kurds and they get what they want, you're going to have other bad things that you may not entirely anticipate emerge as well. So be careful what you wish for. I think that Sykes-Picot, all of this is part of a legacy that can't be undone. But to be fair, the modern nation state is part of a legacy that can't be undone. We could even ask the predominance of the nation state as the organizing unit in the Middle East is also somewhat arbitrary and somewhat recent. But the modern nation state is what we have. We can think about genuine alternatives, but would they be realistic? What does it actually look like to go back to
the Ottomans, perhaps?
yeah, but even someone like Erdogan who fantasizes about the long lost days of the caliphate is someone who is all about the centralization of state power. He's not trying to build a kind of pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire with the millet system. He wants the state to predominate. Why? Because that's the way we think as moderns. I mean, it's very hard to find people left in the world who have lived under old imperial rule. I mean, the Ottoman Caliphate was formally abolished in 1924. So I guess if you're like 99, you might have like overlapped slightly with it, but you probably won't remember what it was like. So we're a product of our own circumstances, and we can't think beyond the state, even if it would be better that we could. So in that sense, we can have theoretical and academic discussions about ideal borders, but if we're trying to be practical, I don't know if that is the most. It's definitely very interesting.
I'm making the point from a purely practical consideration. The philosophical, of course, underpinning is there. And the point is that once you unleash democracy, then certain people may want their state. Certain people may want succession. Because remember, there's a challenge in democracy in the nation state. The nation states, they want continuity. They want the Union. The whole Civil War here in 1861 broke out on that fact. And there'll be bodies, they may want succession. So the right of self-determination may clash with the right to national sovereignty. It's a very practical issue. And we have violence going on in Iraq, in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iran. This whole eruption in Iran began as a Kurdish slogan. And we have Kurdish writers who write regularly about the need for a Kurdish state. So it is not a hypothetical question. It is an unanswered question wherein democracy lights that up. When you say you're for democracy, then this is an issue that is bound to come up.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. That's actually a really important point that, it's unavoidable in a practical sense. I guess I would say that the broader principle that I would want to apply is decentralization, federal structures, autonomy for certain cultural, ethnic, and religious groups to the extent possible, distributing power away from the central state, diffusing power wherever possible. But this applies really anywhere, even in any polarized context, including in our own country here in the US. Part of the reason that political violence seems to be around the corner is because the stakes of elections have simply been raised too high. people feel there is too much at stake, so they're less willing to accept democratic outcomes that are not to their liking. Why? Because the state itself has become a prize. Whoever gets the state can then transform the broader culture or society. So if you want to avoid the outbreak of political violence, you always have to be thinking innovatively, if possible, about how to lower the stakes of political competition, which is one reason that when in doubt, err on the side of proportional representation parliamentary systems. You don't want to have a centralizing president where everyone can project their hopes and despair on this one individual, and then that person then defines the politics of the country and of the era and so forth. But there's a lot of different ways.
Now you're arguing for a form of American democracy where we've seen executive overreach and an increase in executive orders over the years.
Again, against America.
The president has become extremely powerful.
Exactly. Yes. So again, in my ideal world, I'd prefer that the U.S. be a proportional representation parliamentary system, but I don't think that's possible in my lifetime. So, but it's worth remembering how odd the U.S. system is, and that it's not appropriate for other new fledgling democracies, that in a particular geographical district, the party that wins 51% of the vote gets 100% of the representation. That's literally the definition of winner takes all. In other words, in a congressional race, it doesn't matter if you won 49%. You will get no representation in that district because there's going to be one representative, and it's the one who has a majority. So that can be a very frightening thing, because you can have a situation where one party tends to win around 60% and the opposing party tends to win around 40%. And you might have a situation on the national level where it gets very lopsided and the minority party gets very little representation. So that's just, those are the kinds of things that you have to factor in. But is there any guarantee that you can prevent civil war or prevent independence struggles from groups like the Kurds? There's no way to predetermine that outcome. And you're probably right. There will be some civil conflict, in situations where Kurdish rights get more of a hearing in a democratic space. There's no doubt about it. But I don't see, that's something we have to just prepare ourselves for to the extent possible. And there's no way to prevent that risk entirely.
Well, Shadi Hamid, it is fantastic to hear you speak. You've been very thoughtful. You've been extremely insightful in your comments. It has been a real pleasure. It's been a real honor. We have a minute left to go. Do you have any parting words for our audience, for our listeners? Maybe you can tell them where to buy your book.
Yeah, sure. Wouldn't mind doing that. Well, first of all, thank you, Atzel, and to Fair Observer for having me. Really enjoyed this conversation with you. If you're interested in my book, I would certainly encourage you to find a copy or buy one. You can find it on Amazon. The Problem of Democracy is the title. And there's an excerpt in the Atlantic as well called Can Democracy Exist Without Liberalism? If you want to see some of these debates about liberalism versus democracy and how I think through them. And thanks for listening, and feel free to say hello on Twitter or elsewhere where I write and pontificate. Brilliant.
On that note, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and elsewhere, and keep watching. Thank you, Shadi. Pleasure to have you as always. Bye.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.